Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's 6:02 p.m. The presentation will begin at 6:05 while we wait for the audience to trickle in. While we're waiting, a quick round of introductions. As usual for these lecture series, there are no external speakers, just two CMI staff members. You all know me. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work in the Household Survey Division. Along with me, I have Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMIE. More importantly, he is the chief architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. And Mahesh and I will do our best to answer your questions as they come up. Many of you have been here before, but if any of you are new, what you do is you click on the Q&A button, which is on the bottom of your screen, and type in a question. Mahesh will try to answer the question in text, if possible, as the question comes up. Sometimes there are too many questions, and in that case, once the talk is over, Mahesh and I will do our best to answer those questions as long as the audience is still present. A couple of other announcements just before we start. This is the second of a three-part series on survey design. The first was on survey design and sampling. Today is on sample survival and response rate. Next Friday is on weights. Last week's talk is already up on our YouTube channel. If you aren't already a subscriber, please head over to youtube.com/CMIE India and hit the subscribe button. All of the talks that we do at the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, whether they are internal talks done by CMI staff like this one, or whether they are CMI, CPHS research seminars, all those talks are available publicly online. Our next, the third talk in this series, like I said, is next week, same time on Friday, and it's on weights. Weights is incredibly interesting, incredibly exciting. The way in which we do this is, I think, very awesome. So you should come and enjoy what we have to tell you. One more note, all of our documentation, of course, is available online. So if you go to our website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, you can find the material that I'm using for all these talks. Nothing that I'm saying here isn't already in our documentation. All of the documentation is online in PDFs. You need to go to our website and then click on how we do it. There's a long list of documents. You can download any of them. They are freely available. You don't need to be a subscriber to the CPDX service to download any of them. You just need a CMI ID and password that's absolutely free. So please feel free to read through our documentation, send us comments, questions, whatever you have. Our next Consumer Pyramids Household Survey research seminar is this coming Monday. Nishant Kumar and Anand Sahasranaman will talk about income inequality in India. That's at 6 p.m. on Monday. Please do come if you're not already signed up. If you want to know what we're doing a lot. So follow us on Twitter. Our handle is _CPHS. You can also sign up to our mailing list in case you're not already there. Just send me an email. My email address is kkrishnan@cmi.com, and we'll be sure to add you to our mailing list. It's now just a minute past 6:05, so I'll begin the presentation. Mahesh, I'm going to ask you to turn on your mic for just a second and confirm that you can see my screen.
Hi, Kaushik.
Hi, Mahesh. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I'm able to see your screen.
Okay, rock and roll. Thank you. Okay, everyone, we'll begin. Today's topic is sample survival and response rate. This is the second in a three-part series on the survey design in the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Thank you for coming. We had a great turnout last week. Absolutely excellent questions during the Q&A, and I hope that this topic will be as interesting as last week's. Um, this topic or this presentation is based off a note on our How We Do It section with the same title, Sample Survival and Response Rate. That note can be a little complex because it describes in great detail a lot of the things that have happened to our sample across time. So we've done our best to try and turn that into something that you can engage with and think about and ask questions about. And I hope that it's interesting to you, and I hope that it answers questions that many of you as researchers probably have about the panel and the sample and how that's changed across time. So let's dive right in. In 2014, we had a certain sample size. It was about 166,000 households. In 2019, at the end of 2019, we had a larger sample size. We had about 174,000 households. So in between, there was a growth of about 4.6%. And today's talk is all about understanding that growth. There are really two questions that we're trying to answer. The first question is, what happened between 2014 and 2019? The second question is, what are the implications of all of this for research? So not all of you necessarily want to know every single gory detail, but it's our aim to try and tell you as many details as we can, with the hope that this feeds into the way in which you think about the data and gives you the confidence to use the data, the long time series of the data, and make informed decisions about how to handle that data as a researcher. There are three parts to today's talk. The first part is to describe to you all the changes to the sample. The second part is to describe to you how response rates have changed across waves. And then finally, having understood changes to the sample, having understood changes to response rates, to tell you about sample survival and sample attrition. So we're going to start with changes to the sample. And let's go back to that graph that I motivated the beginning of this talk with. Between 2014 and 2019, there was a 4.6% growth in the size of the sample. What happened in those intervening years and intervening waves? Before we get there, there are two caveats, two things that I want to address at the very beginning, because I'm sure this question is on many of your minds. The first question that many of you likely have is, why, Kaushik, have you ended this at 2019? What about 2020? Our answer to you is, just after wave 20 was completed, we did a talk which was about how we surveyed during the lockdown. If you're interested, especially in what happened in the lockdown during the pandemic, which has dominated most of 2020, I would encourage you to go and see that talk. It's available on our YouTube channel. There's also an accompanying note in our documentation section. A longer note certainly requires being written, and that story will come out once the dust settles. There's a second question some of you might have, which is, have I stumbled into the wrong Zoom webinar? Where am I? What is this? Who is this CPHS? So if you're new here, CPHS is a household panel survey that we conduct in India. It's conducted by CMIE. I work at CMIE. We cover about 174,405 households in the survey. We cover them 3 times a year. We ask a large number of questions to these households and to these individuals in those households. If this is your first time here, I strongly recommend that you also see our talk last week, which was on sample design and survey. It's available on YouTube. That will really help you in making sense of the material in this week's talk. All of our documentation is online. And so if you have any questions outside of what we're discussing today, I encourage you to look at other talks that we've done, look at our documentation. And if you still have questions, please don't hesitate to drop us an email. Okay, with those two caveats out of the way, let's get to the business of today's talk. What are the changes that took place to the CPHS sample between 2014 and 2019? Here's a simple graph to demonstrate to you how the sample moved around between 2014 and 2019. I want to highlight a couple of things. Firstly, The largest drop was a drop of 3.6%. That happened in the very first wave. The largest increase was an increase between two consecutive waves, was an increase of 4.5%. And that happened for a very specific reason in 2017 that I'll get to in just a couple of minutes. Why did we add or delete households at all? Right? Why is this not a perfectly steady line across time? So there are a couple of answers that I want to put out there right now at the very beginning, and then we'll investigate some of these answers in some detail. First, you can have locked and unoccupied households. And how do you deal with that in a survey? Second, there can be migration of families. Third, households can go missing. You'll be surprised, but that does happen. Fourth, there can be large-scale interviewer effects, all kinds of other things that have to do with the way in which the survey is itself run and executed. Fifth, sometimes new data comes to light, something that we can use as a surveying body to make the survey better. There can be law and order issues on the ground. There can be all kinds of vagaries and difficulties, and sometimes maybe easy things, but often challenges that take place in the field. And all of these 6 things broadly can have an effect on moving that number around of what the sample size is. Locked and unoccupied households, we know how to deal with those. We have a very standard process. If a household is found to be locked or unoccupied, we make attempts to revisit that household. If it's in a village, we have to do it in the same day or the next day, because we move from village to village to cover all the villages in a homogeneous region or a district or a state. If it's in a town, then a revisit can be planned over multiple days. And we make a lot of attempts to reach these locked and unoccupied households. In fact, even before going into the field, we often do calls with the household members to say, hi, we are coming, will you be available, etc. If despite all this, we find that a household is locked for 3 consecutive waves, then we drop that household from the survey. Then there's another class of issues that can lead to changes in the sample size. If all the members of the household are suddenly replaced with a new set of members, then it used to be the case that that household was dropped in CPHS. In 2016, we relaxed this. We said, we are a survey of households. We are not a survey of families. And so we will survey anybody that's in that household. What we do to make it easier for the researcher is that while the household ID remains the same, member IDs change. And if all of the members of a household leave and they're replaced by a new set of members, there's an additional flag in the data. The flag is called family shifted. And that turns on to tell a researcher that this is now a new family living in that household. But this allows us to continue surveying that household. And there's the issue of missing households. Households go missing all the time. Households in urban areas will get redeveloped. Households in urban areas and also in rural areas will get demolished due to illegality. Households can be sold. There is a huge urban creep that's taking place across India. Cities consume villages, their peri-urban areas. The urban and rural geography of India is changing quite rapidly. Then, of course, there are natural causes. There can be floods, there can be typhoons, there can be earthquakes. There can be all sorts of things that can cause a household to go missing. Now I want to focus on these next 3 candidate explanations. Large-scale interviewer effects, conforming to new data, new information that comes to light, law and order issues, etc. This is really going to be the focus of the next few slides. And I'm going to take you through this in chronological order to show you what accounted for the big changes, both positively and negatively, to the sample size of the survey across time, wave to wave. So this is the 2014 sample. Some of you may be familiar with charts like this. They're sometimes called waterfall charts or cascade charts. and they are designed to help you make sense of the change in levels. So you can see the individual components, both positive and negative. The positive ones have a small line below them, and the negative ones have a small line above them to indicate a drop that's coming next. And we can use that to trace the components that lead to the movement from, say, wave 1 to wave 2. So I'll take you through this to try and explain this to you. For example, the first two drops that you see in the sample size between wave 1 and wave 2 was for a very prudent reason. And the reason was wave 1 was the first wave of the survey. And we knew going in that there would be challenges, there would be difficulties. As a result of that, for quite a few towns, we created a larger sample frame than was necessary. So for those of you that came to last week's talk, this will be fresh in your heads. Remember, we randomly select villages in towns, in districts. We also randomly select towns in homogeneous regions. Each of these towns, we randomly select a minimum of 21 census enumeration blocks. Then within each of those blocks, 16 households are chosen at random using systematic random sampling. What we did is that in certain areas, we said, let's do a couple additional CEBs, or let's do a couple additional households per CEB as a sample frame to set that in the plan for surveying before we hit the ground. Once we hit the ground, we removed a lot of those excess household IDs that were created for those towns. Okay, in total, there were 83 towns for which excess household IDs were created as prudence, as precaution. And then after that surveying was completed, we had too many households from these towns because we have a fairly process-driven approach to determining the sample size for towns and villages based on last week's talk. And in those cases, there was a trimming of that sample size in towns for these 83 towns. Then there were difficulties in surveying. For example, 67 villages in Jharkhand were inaccessible or hostile to our surveying efforts, and they had to be replaced. And in this case, the 67 were replaced by 61, if I remember correctly. Slightly didn't get to full replacement, but got close. We also found large-scale issues with the sample in urban Gujarat and some parts of urban Kerala. In fact, the urban sample in Gujarat had to be redone from scratch. The entire wave 1 urban sample for Gujarat was put aside and we drew a brand new sample. That spilled over into two waves. So you can see that effect both in the transition from wave 1 to wave 2, where we cut down on the urban sample in Kerala and in Gujarat. Kerala was less pronounced compared to Gujarat. And then we create a new sample of households for both of those states. And that happens in wave 1 in a much larger way compared to wave 2. Finally, sometimes individual towns prove to be very difficult. So between wave 2 and wave 3, Jodhpur was proving to be very challenging on the ground. And so the Jodhpur sample had to be revamped. This is an example of the kinds of changes that we did from wave to wave between wave 1 and wave 2 and wave 2 and wave 3, which comprises the first year of the survey, which is 2014. Now let's move to 2015. Oh, I'm sorry. There were 12 other villages across India that were inaccessible, and those had to be dropped in wave 1. With that out of the way, let's move to 2015. There's a similar story. So the 2015 line is along wave 4, but there's also a small change between wave 3, which was the last wave of 2014, and wave 4, which is the first wave of 2015. In particular, we did a huge revamp of the urban sample in 2014 that spilled over into the first wave of 2015. One was when we did the reconfiguration that we needed to do in Gujarat and Kerala. It was done to a lesser extent in other parts of the country, and it caused us to deviate from the target sample size that we wanted for most towns. So if you remember from last week, we did this arithmetic for urban primary sampling units that are towns. Towns are broken up into wards. We choose 21 of those, towns are broken up into wards. Wards are further broken up into census enumeration blocks. We randomly choose 21 blocks to be sampled, and each of those blocks From those blocks, we select 16 households through systematic random sampling. So that leads to a target of 336 households per town. Now that's a minimum. For larger towns, we're going to bump that sample up, but that 336 target is a minimum target for every town. When we did this rejig in Gujarat, in Kerala, in Maharashtra to some degree, in certain other parts of India, it caused us to deviate from this 336 target. So we had to do a second rejig to get that number back into line, that we wanted to hit approximately 336, if not exactly 336 households for most towns in the sample. That's the second reason why you see such a big movement in urban India. In 2015, or thereabouts, census published information on the distribution of households only for towns, the distribution of households by the materials used for floors, roofs, and walls. And we realized while we were executing the survey that we can observe what is the quality of the floor, the wall, the roof in these households, in our sample households. And we noticed that our sample was not lining up with the representation that census was telling us was the case from the information that they had released. And so again, there was a rejig of our urban sample to bring that representation that was coming out of the census documentation. Now, I want to make a point here. This is not to say that we are stratifying on any of these things. We're not, because this question came up last time. We don't stratify on SES and we don't stratify on any of these materials or anything like that. It was a one-time effort which was done to bring representation closer in our sample to what census was saying was true universally of towns in terms of the materials that were used by households in those towns for their roofs, floors, and walls. Now, let's move to 2016. 2016, between wave 6 and wave 7, there was no change. But then again, in wave 7, there were some changes and some spillover changes into wave 8. In wave 7, as you can see, there's first a significant increase in the rural coverage in Maharashtra. We decided we can expand our coverage in Maharashtra. At the same time, some of the issues that we saw in Gujarat and Kerala, we saw similar issues cropping up in Maharashtra. And so towns in Maharashtra went through the same rejigging exercise that Gujarat and Kerala went through. Now, keep in mind, this is just the beginning of the third year of our survey. So it's still very early days where there was a little bit of this rejigging that was necessary in ensuring that the survey made sense, that we were able to collect data that can actually be used to tell a story that is in fact representative of the areas that we survey. There's a similar revamping that was done in Jharkhand, only for 4 towns. In those 4 towns, a quarter of the sample approximately for each of those towns needed to undergo a bit of a rejig. So this is what happened in 2016. Let's move to 2017. Between wave 9 and wave 10, there's a tiny change. That is the addition of 2 towns, Washim and Buldana, in the state of Maharashtra. Washim was added as a replacement for a town whose name I'm blanking on, but it will come back to me. That town was a twin town of Aurangabad, and that meant that we were sampling too much in that region. And so that town was dropped, and then Washim was added as another town. That the town's name will come to me in a second. I'm sure Mahesh, when he starts his answers to questions in the Q&A, with his encyclopedic memory, will remember the name of the town. In wave 10, between wave 10 and wave 11, we dropped a town. This is an interesting town. It's a town worth talking about in some more detail. A town called Singrauli in Jharkhand. This is a coal mining town. And what happened in this town is that the population in that town was just not stable. Either you're a government officer that was somehow involved in the activities or the management of activities in this town, and those officers would get transferred very often, or you were a truck driver or somebody else like that, in which case there was a lot of movement in and out of the household. It is not a very stable population, and it'd be seasonal work, but you'd be away from the household for a long period and come back in. Or there'd be a fairly large migrant population of people working in the mines or doing some other work that was ancillary to this work. That population was, again, very transitory. And so there were so many difficulties in ensuring the quality of data that was collected, because we weren't able to benchmark against what had happened the previous wave because the inhabitants themselves had changed so often, for example, that we dropped a town like Singrauli for these kinds of issues. And these issues, they do occur. You find, so for example, Mahesh has told me the story of a census town that has a population of 1. I've forgotten again what the name of that town is. Perhaps Mahesh can remind us when he does the Q&A. There are all kinds of these funny things that only crop up once you're actually doing the surveying, and the surveying has to account for these realities. Now, there was also a rural revamp that took place between wave 11 and wave 12. Along with that, you see a new color, this red color, and that is an expansion. That's the first expansion of the survey that we did in a systematic way. We expanded from 420 districts rurally to 505 districts rurally. There was a very large expansion of our rural sample. And we also started to add states. So between wave 11 and wave 12 in 2017, we added the state of Tripura. And that accounted for, again, a small increase in the sample size. Now let's move to 2018. So between wave 12 and wave 13, there were small changes. Between wave 13 and wave 14, there were again some small changes with one somewhat larger change. And then between wave 14 and wave 15, we added a new state. So again, there is a small rural revamp that took place between 12 and 13 and then 13 and 14. Additionally, we added the state of Meghalaya between wave 12 and wave 13. In between wave 13 and wave 14, we also, in the way similarly as in the year previous to this 2017, we had expanded our rural coverage. In 2018, we expanded our urban coverage. How did we do this? We didn't select new towns, but we added new CEBs to existing towns, and that beefed up our urban sample in between wave 13 and wave 14. And finally, between wave 14 and wave 15, I believe we added the state of Sikkim. And so that was another small addition to the sample size. That brings us to almost 2019. Between wave 15 and wave 16, there were a couple of small changes. One town in Tamil Nadu, Pattukotte, and one town in Assam, Tezpur, were added to the sample. We added additional villages in Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, Rajasthan, Meghalaya. And that is how we got to the sample, which was steady from 2019 onwards. This is the number that many of you now know, that number of 174,405 households. Okay, so in a nutshell, this takes you through the changes that took place to the CPHS sample between 2014 and 2019, and the constituent components of that aggregate rise of about 4.6% between 2014 and 2019. Now, with this out of the way, the next thing that I think we need to study and understand well are response rates. So moving to response rates, here is a step diagram of the response rate from wave to wave between 2014 and 2019. The y-axis is the response rate measured in percent. The x-axis is the number of waves from wave 1 all the way through wave 18. Now, let me try and help you in making sense of this figure. In 2014, the average was 87%. In 2015, that average dropped slightly to 85%. In 2016, it dropped further to about 83%. In 2017, it was our lowest at 82%, started to rise again in 2018 to 85%, and it's held steady there in 2019 as well, and it was about, again, 84, 85%. Okay, we can do even better than just these annual numbers, but the point that I'd like to try to drive home here is to show you that despite all the changes in sample that you saw earlier, the response rate is remarkably constant. You see a lot of variation, but that's by design because I've truncated the axis of this graph. If it was just going from 0 to 100, it would look like a flat line. Everything is between 80 to, on the high end, 82 on the low end to 87% on the high end. Just a 5 percentage point difference across 5 years of surveying and data collection, 6 years of surveying and data collection. Those of you that know what's happened in 2020, of course, the response rates have changed dramatically. The last round of the survey collection that we did, the response rate was only about 70%. That's still very high given the difficulties of having to survey during the lockdown. And the lockdown is an event unlike anything else. And I would urge all of you to keep your questions on the lockdown, your thoughts on the lockdown aside. Let us get through this wave, a couple more waves, and we'll write the story of everything that happened during the lockdown. But before that, it was remarkably consistent between 82 and 87%. I'll say one last thing, though, about current surveying efforts. As many of you know, those of you that use our monthly data, our response rates are actually rising. So we're escaping that lockdown shadow. And I'm quite confident that we'll be in this ballpark again quite soon. Now, I want to focus for just a minute on wave 17. Wave 17 had an acceptance of 85.23%, quite high. And I want to take you through the reasons for non-response because we capture that in the survey. The highest reason for non-response, 5.88% of the total sample, was because the survey itself could not be executed on those households. The next highest reason is that the household itself was locked. That's about 3.6%. 2.5% of households were not found. 1.6% of households refused. 0.63% of households were surveyed, but the data was not accepted because it wasn't of high enough quality. And 0.57% of households were dropped. There's some small amount that's dropped every way. Like I mentioned to you, it can happen, for example, if a household is locked 3 times in 3 consecutive waves, etc. The point to note here is that once you're in the domain of non-response, right, that's everything from the second row down to the last row, the single largest contributor to non-response is could not be executed, which accounts for 5.88% of the total sample. Okay, so that's 6 percentage points of about 15 percentage points of non-response. So a lot of the non-response, almost half of the non-response, is because it could not be executed. I want to tell you why that's the case. Some of you have seen an earlier talk that I gave about, how am I doing on time? I'm doing pretty good. Some of you saw an earlier talk that I gave about how we conduct the survey, and that was done in the light of the lockdown. I borrowed a slide from there because it helps to explain this could not be executed phenomenon. A wave, as many of you know, is broken up into 4 months. We do 3 waves in a year. So by arithmetic, each wave has 4 months in it. They're called month slot 1, month slot 2, month slot 3, month slot 4. We ensure that when you have a sample of 174,405 households, that in every month, there's an equal number of households that are getting executed for survey. And they're also equally spread out across the country. Now, this is important to do because otherwise we would miss, if we lumped all the survey into say month 4 or in month 2, we'd miss some important richness in the way in which household behavior changes across time, right? For example, if I chose not to do surveying in months that had many festivals, that would be a very bad idea because we would miss out on the changes in income, changes in labor force participation, changes in consumption patterns during festival times. If I chose not to survey during agricultural harvest because it's too difficult to get responses, we'd miss out on a lot of the important actual variation in economic behavior across the year. And so for that reason, we make sure that we execute the same number of households approximately every month of the survey. In fact, as those of you that came to the previous talk know, it's not just every month. We do the planning on a weekly level. So the 4-month slots translate into 16-week slots. And we ensure that there's an equal number of households getting surveyed across the country week by week, as well as within a week geographically across the country. There's another reason we do this, which is that we also provide fast frequency estimates. For example, many of you are users of our fast frequency estimation on employment, unemployment. All of that can only be done with confidence if we have an even execution of households across time, as well as an even execution of households geographically across space. So to ensure that this happens, we have very strict protocols. Firstly, we don't allow a spillover of more than 2 days within a week. That's all the room that someone has as a survey manager or as a surveyor to ensure that a household that was slotted for a particular week actually gets done. They can't exceed that 7-day period by more than 2 days. We permit almost no spillover between months. So if a household was slotted to be surveyed in month slot 2, very, very, very rarely will a household be permitted to be surveyed in month slot 3. And we have an absolute hard rule. Between waves, there is no spillover permitted. So if you want to survey a household that should have been surveyed in December, in January, it just can't be done. We don't permit that. Because if we allow that, that changes the continuity and the even execution week by week and month by month. And we can't afford that because that's critical to the way in which the data is consumed and turned into representative estimates. So we're willing to sacrifice sample, sometimes as much as almost half of the total non-response, if those households cannot be executed on time. So this is the big message here. If a household cannot be surveyed within a small window, it does not get surveyed at all during the wave. And this is a call that we have taken to ensure that continuity and evenness of execution comes before sample size, because the continuity and the evenness is much more important for the ability to produce representative estimates. So let's go back now to this breakdown of non-response. I hope that helps to explain why you see this 5.88% could not be executed in any given wave. So if you look at the more recent waves, the waves during the lockdown, again, the bulk of the non-response, the overwhelming majority of the non-response could not be executed. And that's because of the difficulties in lockdown conditions of reaching all the households in the sample. It's not because of selective non-response. It's not because households are refusing to participate. In fact, the trend is very similar to what I'm showing you in wave 17, but let's stick to wave 17 because I said to you that this is the talk before the lockdown, and so we'll keep it to that for now. If you look at the number of households that refused, it's a very, very small portion, 1.6% of all households in the sample, not 1.6% of non-response. 1.6% of all households in the sample didn't participate in the survey because they refused. Okay, everything else could not be executed. The lion's share of non-response is due to the careful planning and the process that we have in place. Of course, there are things like locked. We do what we can, as I mentioned, but beyond that, there's not much that we can do. If a household can't be found, it can't be found. And a small number, like I mentioned, are not accepted or dropped. So this gives you a sense of how household non-response breaks down for a given wave. This is quite representative of the story that takes place wave to wave. The actual numbers will, of course, vary, but this is broadly the story in any given wave. Now that that's out of the way, I want to do with non-response the same thing that I did earlier with changes in the sample, which is to take you through wave 1, which is the black dot all the way on the very left-hand side of your screen, to wave 18, and to take you through it wave to wave. And even though there's a very small variation in response rates between 82 to 87%, to demonstrate to you the reasons for these changes. So in wave 1, as I'd mentioned, Gujarat and Kerala were difficult for us. And so those areas suffered due to poor team leadership. And Jharkhand had an inflated sample for reasons that I'd also described, where we added extra CEBs and extra household IDs in regions that we knew we might face some difficulty when we're adding, when we're starting a survey in those areas. In waves 2 and 3, the Gujarat and Kerala problems continued. In wave 4, Kerala was by and large taken care of. Gujarat continued. We had some new problems in execution in Haryana, in Karnataka, in Assam. In wave 5, Gujarat was finally set right. Assam continued to struggle, and we had a new set of challenges in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, where teams had a lot of difficulty in reaching remote locations and some of the very rural areas. Wave 6 and 8 is where you start to see, what I like to call acts of God. Things that we really couldn't do anything about. So coastal Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu were disrupted due to very heavy rainfall. There was also very heavy rain in Jharkhand, that made accessing inner areas, rural areas, remote areas quite difficult for us between wave 6 and 8. In wave 9, there were quite a few acts of God. Jharkhand was again disrupted by heavy rains. There were the Uri attacks and the Nagrota attacks in Jammu and Kashmir. There was demonetization. On top of that, there were also survey issues. Our field teams continue to resist to make visits into more internal rural parts of Madhya Pradesh and Jharkhand. In wave 11, Madhya Pradesh continued to be a difficulty for us. There were floods in Assam. There were attacks in Amarnath and Jammu and Kashmir. Wave 12 was our lowest response rate. We fell to 80.6%. It was primarily because of under-par execution in Odisha, in Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat again, partly because of team attrition and partly because we didn't have the capacity to handle that team attrition. Wave 13 and 14, we took some big strides happened that knocked us back down a little bit. That carried over a little bit into wave 16. There were also team attrition in wave 16 in Andhra Pradesh, in Assam, in Jharkhand. And then finally, between wave 17 and 18, there was an internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir, which made our serving difficult in that region. And so that gives you a quick summary of the things that moved our response rate around. Again, the total band is very small. It's just 5 percentage points. But within that band, this gives you the story of what primarily drove the response rate. Okay, so now we're done with the changes to the sample as well as describing to you what the response rates are like. And I want to pause here and recap a little bit to try and put things into perspective. Why did we tell you this story at all? Why go into these nitty-gritty details? It's the most important reason here is that we're absolutely committed to transparency. We want everything to be known. Okay, there's no part of the survey, the way in which we run it, the way in which we plan it, how we execute it. There's nothing that's secret. And so we're really committed to being transparent about everything that's happened. And we're documenting that. It's documented in PDFs and it's also documented through these talks. And it recognizes something that many of you probably already know. Surveying is a difficult business. Surveying all across India is a very difficult business. And despite these difficulties, we ensured that in every way there was enough sample to make good estimates. Even when it dropped, it was still in 160,000 household range. There was no cherry picking, and this is what I want to really emphasize. There were changes, but the changes were not cherry picked changes. We still had to ensure coverage in every HR because we divided the country into HRs when we did our planning. And we have to follow that. So we have to ensure coverage in every HR. We still have to choose villages, towns, and CEBs through simple random selection. We still have to choose households through systematic random selection. So all the changes that took place they took place within the rules that are laid down in our survey design and sampling protocols. And that's what I described to you in painstaking detail last week. And household IDs, member IDs, they never overlapped. Households may have changed, but then households were assigned new IDs for those new households. And so as a researcher, you still have complete control over the data that you choose to rely upon. And it's our job to explain to you what those changes are so that you can make an intelligent decision on what data to use. Okay, so I hope that this the reasons for why we're telling you this makes sense to all of you. I want to move now to sample survival and attrition. Okay, now here, the best way to show this to you is through tables. And tables can be difficult to read and even more difficult to explain. So I'm not going to try and explain everything. I'm referring to tables that are in this very document, but I want to show all of you how you can read it and how you can navigate these tables. So if you take the first column here, this is the table that tells you about the survival of households conditional acceptance. So this doesn't mean they're in the sample. They're in the sample and they were surveyed and the survey data was accepted into the system. Okay, so it's a very high bar. So it shows you that of the 145,984 households in wave 1, if you go all the way down to wave 18, you get 24,647 households from that original sample that remain in wave 18. Okay, and you can do this going from column to column for any wave of your choice. Now, suppose you go to the middle, suppose you go to wave 9. Wave 9, the number in wave 9 was 132,777 households. If you go down, it tells you how many of those households continued in the survey across waves. If you go up, it tells you how many of the new households that came in wave 9 were present in previous waves. Okay, so I hope that tells you how you can read through these tables. You can also do this, you can also do another exercise, which is to look through these tables to find what is the survival probability for a household. And of course, there are better ways of doing this because you can pool across waves. But if you just took one wave as an example, if you look at wave 1, to get through all 6 years, about 16.9% of all households survive. If you use wave 9 as an example and you ask the question, how many households survive for 3 years? It's a fairly good number. 39.5% of households from wave 9 survived 3 years. If you look for a 2-year margin, then wave 12 is illuminating, because that shows you that about over 50%, 54.6% survived 2 years in wave 12. Okay. Another way to look at this is just look at the 2-year survival rate. And if you look at wave 3, that survival rate was 46%. If you look at wave 12, that survival rate is 54%. So it's increasing over time. And this shows that the survey is getting better. Our ability to retain households is getting better across time. So where only 46 out of 100 households survived 2 years in wave 3, 54 of those households survive in wave 12. Okay, so our ability to conduct the survey and to retain households in the sample, in the panel, is getting better across time. This is another table that's useful. It's the last table of that note. This is the share of common acceptance across waves. And I want to show you again how to read this. The important column, the most important column, is this column all the way on the right. It tells you what is the, for example, the first row tells you that there's almost a 90% survival rate, regardless of the wave. If you look at wave to wave, how many households survive? Okay, that's the topmost cell of that last column. You can also look at, for example, this, which is how many households survive 1 year, regardless of which wave they started in. Across waves, on average, 68.8% of households survive 1 year in the sample. If you ask 2 years, that's about 50%, 49%. If you ask 3 years, that's about 35.9%, almost 36%. Okay, quite close to what I showed you on the earlier slide. But the earlier slide was just taking one wave as a constant. This is pooling and averaging across waves. Okay, the rows are the constituent components of that average. So for example, what this row 10 is saying to you is there's a 34.5% chance of survival if you were in wave 1, 35.3% chance of survival in wave 2, etc. And that number is going up, right? So if you're in wave 9, there's a 39.5% chance that you survive 3 years. This is also the point that I made on the previous slide, which is over time, the likelihood of surviving for any period of time, in this case 3 years, is increasing as the survey continues, as our ability to conduct the survey improves. And so even though the grand mean for surviving 3 years is 35.9%, the more recent households selected in wave 9, wave 8, wave 7 are much closer to, in fact, 40%, right? And so we can expect that as we continue to do the survey across time, these rates of retention will increase and we'll get better. Okay, so that's really it. What I wanted to do on sample survival and attrition was to just take you through how to read those tables, give you one illustrative example so that you can look through those tables at the end of the note yourselves. And each of you will have different questions, right? Some of you will have a research interest that needs data between 2015 and 2018. Someone else will want to know about a different time period. So those tables will help you navigate whatever area you're interested in and help you get a sense of what portion of the sample is usable for you in your research. Keep in mind, all of this is important only when you start to exploit the panel nature of the data, where you need the same observation across time. By and large, so far, a lot of people are using the cross-sectional variation. You're comparing, say, the mean employment rate in 2015 with the mean employment rate in 2019. That's great. And it's more recently that researchers are starting to really exploit the panel dimension of this data set, and they're tracking households across time, right? For example, I'm sure the authors are here, but many of you would have seen the talk given by Amit Basole, Surbhi Kesar, and Rosa Abraham a couple of weeks ago. Even just the talk last week by Maurizio Busolo, Siddharth Sharma, and Ananya Kotia at our research seminars, they exploit the panel nature of our data, right? And so we are very glad at CMI that researchers are starting to do this. And these sample survival and attrition tables become more important when you start to look at the panel seriously and to exploit that panel to say something very interesting that's happening at the household level across time, pooling many households together. Okay, so putting this all together, you understand the changes in the sample, you understand changes in response rates. Both of those are inputs to the output, which is final sample survival and sample attrition. So let's tie this all together and conclude what finally matters, right? So what finally matters, point one, is there was approximately a 4.5% growth in sample between 2014 and 2019. What finally matters, point two, is that the response rate is very, very high. Response rate of almost 85% on average. So, a couple of months ago, I was making a presentation to a bunch of folks that study household finance in the US, and they were absolutely shocked at our response rates. These response rates are so much higher than the response rates that you find for surveys in Europe, in the US, for example. This is a really high response rate of 85%. One-wave survival rate is almost 90%. Again, that's great. Two-year survival rate, sorry, not just two-wave, 2-year, that's 6 waves survival rate is almost 50%, closer to 60% for new waves. And almost 25,000 households have participated in every single wave, from wave 1 in 2014 all the way to the end of 2019. Almost 25,000 households participate in every single wave. That's just mind-bogglingly huge to me, right? I mean, this is the beauty of having a survey that's got a sample frame of 165,000 households on the low end. So even if there's non-response, 25,000 households participate in every single wave. That's really great for researchers. Survival rates are improving. This is my final point. Okay, so survival rates are improving. They're going to get better and better across time. COVID notwithstanding, lockdown notwithstanding. So it remains to be seen what 2020 does to long-term panel stability. We are as invested in a stable panel as you are. We are more invested in a stable panel than you are, probably. So we are doing everything we can to ensure that the panel is stable. We're doing everything we can to ensure that retention rates grow over time. And I'm confident that as we start to escape the lockdown and COVID-19, survival rates will start to improve again and improve very, very rapidly. Okay, so that's all we have to say today. Thank you again for your patience. We've reached almost an hour. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. If some of you joined in a little late, that's my email address on the right-hand side, kkrishnan@cmi.com. On the left-hand side is Mahesh Vyas's email address. Mahesh Vyas is the chief architect of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. And now we're going to turn to Q&A if there are any questions remaining and start to answer them. So I'm going to turn off, stop sharing my screen now. Oh, wow. Okay, Mahesh, only one Q&A this time. Would you like to turn on your video and your microphone? Hi, Mahesh.
Thank you for the presentation. There were a few questions down the line, and I have answered most of them. There's one outstanding now. That's only asking for your email ID, Kaushik, which
I will respond to that.
Yeah, he's got it. Okay,
are there any points you would like to raise in general, Mahesh? Any Any things that you'd like to add to the talk that I gave now?
No, I think all is well. The 2 points that you were asking me to answer, the two names of the towns. So the first was Buldana, replaced Waluj.
Yeah.
And the second point is, which is the smallest town in India? It is a town called Valia in Gujarat. It had a population of 5 in
Okay.
2011, and it is what is called as an industrial town. So there could be a reason why such a small town exists. Obviously, it can't exist. It could be just one family over there, possibly. But that's the smallest town we have, 5 people in that town.
Okay.
That's it.
Great.
Otherwise, I think we have answered all the questions. There are 2 questions that have come up now.
Yeah, I see Fenella's question. Hi, Fenella. Fenella and I went to grad school together. Thanks for joining us all the way from Europe. Great question. Just for everybody else, in case you can't see it, what incentives do households have to respond to the survey? Do they receive a payment? Fenella, the answer is no. We don't incentivize households in any way. There are no payments made. We're very obsessive about this because once payments are made, it changes the incentives, not just on the extensive margin of response and non-response, but also on what households choose to say. So we've stayed away completely from payment. We have no intention of making payments. In fact, as I think you know, Fenella, but I'm sure others in the audience know, we sometimes partner to do surveys with others. We actively turn away requests where there are requests made for cash transfers to households, etc., because we believe as a rule that when we do surveying, we should not accept anything in cash or in kind, or give anything in cash in kind to the households that are in our sample. Mahesh, you can back me up, but I believe the only relaxation to this rule is that we're allowed to accept chai.
Oh yes, we get a lot of hospitality from our panel. They're very kind to us. There have been many instances where interviewers were stuck because of bad weather or got seriously wet in the rain that came in suddenly. They have been dealt with very nicely by the household and by the neighborhood. We do not give any gifts to any household. We have turned down many companies that have told us that, can you carry our small little pouch, maybe giving us a shampoo pouch or something of the kind. We have said no, we do not want to look commercial at all and don't want to have any ulterior motive in this. But we do one thing. We do give a calendar every year, a wall calendar to our households every year. We could not do it this year. So in 2021, they will not have a calendar from us, but every year in the past, we have given them a wall calendar that provides use. It's a utility calendar. It's a big wall calendar, which has got big numbers for dates with a lot of space on the side that you can scribble small little notings on that. On the side is a panel that helps them note down, if they would like to note down how much milk did they receive this time, made a payment to somebody. It's a utility calendar. But on the flip side of every page, we give actual data. So the data that we collected from the households last time is converted into tables, charts, so on and so forth, and all of that is printed so they can see how their state compares to other states with respect to many indicators. Many of them have appreciated that. Lots of the neighborhoods ask us for the calendar, and we readily give as many as are available with us.
Thanks, Mahesh. There are in fact, 3 great questions that have just come into the chat box. Perhaps you can answer them verbally. First, there's a question from Mala Srivastava. What proportion of your households belong to HNIs, and what is the response rate in these households? I know that you are working, as we speak, Mahesh, on some new documentation on putting together some of these summaries. But would you like to just quickly answer this question to Mala?
No, I don't have a good, reliable number off my head. So I would wait for some time. Maybe we can give her an answer over email afterwards.
Understood. Thank you, Mala. We'll definitely get back to you with that. Mahesh, there's another question here from Sneha Mani. Do your surveyors develop a relationship with households which help them with higher response rates? Are surveys matched with households? Does the same surveyor visit a household multiple times, etc.?
So this is layered. The interviewer has a relationship, but the relationship is very transactional. The same interviewer, by design, does not go to the same household one wave after another. So we change the team between 2 waves or 3 waves if we can. And interviewers stay in the company for a max of 3 years. At a stretch, maybe 3.5 years. So we don't want that familiarity to be too high between the interviewer and the respondent. But there is a very strong relationship that we have, which is one of confidence in the company, between the supervisor and the household. So the supervisor knows the household quite well. In our parlance, we call it the field information officer. The field information officer knows the territory very well, knows the neighborhood very well, and knows the household very well. But the supervisor never ever conducts the interview. It's by design. The interview is always conducted by an interviewer, and that person may revisit the household only once in a year, but not 3 times in a year.
Thanks, Mahesh. In fact, there's another question here by Darishi Shah, where they say that they're very impressed by the response rate and what is the magic formula. In a way, I think Sneha's question kind of asked if this is a part of the magic formula. It's also, I think, a useful segue for us, because once we are done with this series on survey design, the next big thing that I think we really want to tell our audience, our research audience about, is about how we execute the survey. And so a lot of the questions that people have on what are we doing right or wrong, but I think most of the questions are what are you doing right to get such high response rates, and how do you actually conduct the survey? I think a lot of those questions will be answered in subsequent talks. For example, there's another question here from Akshita asking what we do to ensure that answers are not biased and that respondents provide accurate and honest answers. Akshita, we do a lot. We do a lot both in the technology that we use. So we have an app. The app is constantly doing validations to make sure that data entered in one part of the survey for a given household matches that own household's response in another part of the survey. We are constantly checking, because we have the historical data, whether what the household is saying this wave matches what the household has said in the past. We're also checking against the neighborhood. So if one household in the neighborhood is reporting 25,000 rupees of potato purchase in a month, where none of the other households are reporting that, we see that immediately in the data. So we have a bunch of algorithmic checks, inbuilt checks into the app, on top of an amazing human supervision layer. We have multiple kinds of supervisors. Some supervisors are region experts. So for example, a story that Mahesh told me, which I love to recount to others, is that there was a supervisor in Tamil Nadu that alerted us to a potential issue with consumption expenditure on outdoor entertainment, because according to him, there was a new Rajni movie that was out, which meant that households had to be paying more than they were paying earlier. So we have that kind of supervision, which is understanding a geography, understanding the culture and the people very well. And we have another kind of supervision, which is just in making sure that the data quality of the households that you supervise is very high. So this is a short answer, Akshita, to a very, very long, to actually a very great question, which requires a much longer answer. And in fact, we'll probably end up doing a talk, I think, just on this, but certainly on survey execution and the machinery and the operations that we use to get survey execution done in great detail very, very soon. I think, Mahesh, these are all the questions. We've done a great job this time of wrapping up both the presentation and answering all the questions while the presentation was going on. Again, to the audience, thank you so much for coming. I'm counting almost 30 questions. So thanks for the questions. I haven't had a chance to look through the answers myself. I will. As always, the talk will be made available on YouTube immediately because it's being live streamed. Answers to your questions will feed back into the documentation, and they will also be turned into a Q&A that you'll be able to look at later. Thanks for sitting through what can be some very dense material. And I really look forward, Mahesh and I both look forward to welcoming you next week when we're going to talk about a topic that's quite complex, has a lot of nuances, but is incredibly important since so many of you have asked us questions on this, which is how do we create our weights and how do you as researchers use them in your research applications? So please come again next week, Friday, same time as today, 6 p.m. IST, to have what's going to be a very, very interesting conversation on weights. Mahesh, thank you so much for giving us your time. And thanks to the audience again for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone who attended this session, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.